This is a work of fiction. It read like a confession someone never intended to share, and it changed the way I looked at fame, prayer, and the quiet machinery behind both. The story of Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power began for me in a windowless records room behind a Beverly Hills law office where estates went to be unaudited and boxed. I stood over a row of bankers' boxes marked with the names of people who had already become myths. A woman from the firm handed me a paper cup of bad coffee and a list of lots that needed cataloging for a private sale. The list said assorted hats, personal, and next to it, a tidy note in pencil, props. I lifted a cream hat box from under a garment bag that still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and powder. Inside, between a mink pillbox and a summer straw bonnet, sat a flat rectangle wrapped in tissue. When I peeled it back, the room felt colder. The cover looked like a journal a schoolgirl might have brought to Sunday school, pale blue leather, the edges worn like the hems of a dress. In the lower right corner, embossed in tiny gold, the initials weren't MM but NM. Norma Jean. The latch had a tiny brass key and it already turned. I breathed through the old perfume that rose when it opened. On the first page, in looping hand with a schoolteacher's patience, someone had written, "If a light loves you, it asks nothing. If it asks, it is not light." Below it, faint pencil lines divided the page into dates: November 1958, December 1958, January 1959. Every entry lived in the past. Every entry felt like gravel under silk. It read like the opposite of image making. It read like unvarnished thought. And as I moved through it, I realized I had stumbled into the marrow of the title that would later follow me everywhere. Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power. The diary began with small things. A waiter's hand setting down a glass of milk. A woman in a church basement handing her a folded napkin because she had cried quietly through most of a lecture on forgiveness. An address in pencil to a theater on 44th Street. The handwriting leaned forward as if hurrying itself before courage changed its mind. I believed applause made me clean, one entry said from December 1958, the ink faint from having been written with a pen that had to be coaxed. But it left dust. I went to a church where they sang until their throats went out. The preacher had on a diamond bigger than the first ice cube I saw. I thought, he worships the mirror. I closed my eyes and asked God to hide all the mirrors and leave one window open. The diary surprised me because it did not circle the places the world expected it to circle. It did not linger on the gossip. It walked toward a different kind of hunger. I do not belong to a church, she had written early on in 1959, and I do not belong to a party. I belong to a question: am I loved if I am not looking at the camera? I asked God in the bath like a child, are you here if no one is? The word God appeared without capitals sometimes and then with a capital, as if she still argued with herself about reverence. She wrote about the ritual she invented because the rituals she had seen felt like theater. I lit one candle and I took off my makeup and I tried not to improve myself, she wrote. I told the candle, I am the same girl who stole raisins from the kitchen at the orphanage. I told the flame, make me brave enough to lose. The blue leather creaked when pages turned, and more than once I had to stop because the things she believed about power punched through the decades like fresh air into a basement. Power hates asking, she wrote, and I was trained to ask. Would you like me like this? Would you like me like that? Men who kept offices on the highest floors had their smiles nailed to their faces. They said I had it and then they asked if I would hand it over for safekeeping. There was a night described in careful language, no names, only nouns with the edges worn off, at a hotel where everyone knew the exits by heart. A man whose face lived on coins sat next to me and told me the country loved me, she wrote. I thought, the country loves what it does not know. He asked if I prayed. I said, I whisper before sleeping. He said, to whom? I said, to whatever would still love me if my lipstick washed off. He laughed in the good way and then his eyes went empty, like a theater after the last performance. She did not draw blood. That surprised me most. She wrote about people who controlled rooms like weather systems and she refused to hurt them even on paper. The shocking part of the belief, the thing that made the title Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power more than a headline, lived in a sentence that appeared after a silence. "If I am only powerful when I am looked at, then the eyes have the power, not me," she wrote. "A woman who belongs to her own breath is dangerous in a better way." She wrote that she practiced disappearing. She described a day in New York when she put on a gray coat, flattened her hair, wore no scent, and walked 5 blocks without a single person stopping her. "I thought it would kill me," she wrote. "It saved me. I bought a roll from a corner stand and ate it with my fingers. No one watched me chew. I begged God to let me stay that kind of alive. I kept catalog notes I was supposed to keep, dimensions, condition, provenance guesses, and yet my pencil drifted into her sentences as if the paper could keep up with both of us. There were entries from studios described simply as the office. They did not know where to put me if I did not perform girlishness on command," she wrote. "They did not know where to put me if I was serious. Acting asked me to believe in a truth until my body told the truth. I made a prayer that my mind could become stronger than my picture." She returned to faith in circles, the way a person returned to a beach where the tide kept erasing what had been written. "A pastor told me God was jealous," she wrote. "It frightened me because I already knew jealousy. I decided God was not a producer. Producers demanded numbers. I wanted a God who counted breaths." She wrote about the smell of hymnals and the feel of varnished wood and the way light cut a pew into pieces. "I believed God sat in the back with the women who came in late and wore the wrong shoes," she wrote. "I believed power sat up front and timed the sermon." She did not scold. She observed. "I learned to tell the difference between a performance and a blessing," she wrote. A blessing did not stare. There were pages devoted to the small economies of being watched. "I could buy mercy," she wrote, "with a smile placed in the right place at the right time. A smile is a coin. I hated that." She described a photograph shoot where everyone praised what the camera saw while she felt a kind of nausea because the truth in the room stayed outside the frame. "I asked for 5 minutes alone," she wrote. "I stood in the bathroom and looked in a mirror and I said out loud, 'I am not for sale today.' I went back and nothing had changed, but something had changed." She told on herself with a kind of humor that kept the pages soft where they might have hardened. "I lied about my age and my appetites," she wrote. "I told the truth when it cost me work. I tried to tell the truth about what I needed and then I panicked and pretended I needed less. I prayed without folding my hands because that felt like a stage direction. I prayed while standing in line." The more I read, the more this hidden diary braided the words faith and power like they were 2 sides of the same rope. "When a man with a navy tie poured me another drink and said he could make calls," she wrote, "I said, I can make calls too. I can call my body back to me." He did not understand that sentence. I hardly did either, but saying it made heat in my chest. She wrote about a friend who taught her to breathe from her belly. "It felt like smuggling," she wrote. "It felt like I had stolen something back I had given away when I learned to turn my body into a picture. I turned a page and found a pressed sprig of something that had gone almost colorless, lavender maybe. Beneath it, a thin envelope, unsealed. Inside, a paper clipped to a typed note. The note had a typewriter ribbon that needed replacing. If anyone ever reads this," the note said, "please read it kindly. I wrote it when I was not pretending." The page attached to it carried one of the diary's clearest lines, "I did not distrust God. I distrusted men who said they spoke for him." She described a television preacher she watched for 20 minutes before turning the set off. "He sold the cure and the disease," she wrote. "I wanted a God who did not sell." In the middle section of the diary, she wrote about the city that treated her like an ongoing parade. "On sunset the palms held the sky up while the billboards sold me different versions of myself," she wrote. At a party a woman said, "You must be powerful to make them all listen." I smiled and did not say, "Listen to what?" Power without a voice felt like a photograph of food. Pretty and no nourishment. She told the story of a seamstress who had put secret pockets into one of her dresses. She said, "You need a hidden place for your own hand. I put the diary in one of those pockets once and walked around the block. The diary made a quiet sound as it closed and opened, the hinge as tender as a wrist. The seamstress appeared again later, in a small apartment near Melrose, where the two women ate soup from chipped bowls and spoke about the difference between fear and intuition. She said, "Fear says, no, intuition says, not that door." I wrote it down like a new prayer. There were men in the diary, yes, but the men were weather, not maps. They came in as pressure systems and left as broken thermometers. She wrote about a studio lawyer with perfect hair who told her to say, "I'm so grateful," to questions that were not questions. He believed gratitude was a leash, she wrote. I cut it and apologized anyway. Old habits. She listed her habits like a grocery list: over-apologizing, undereating, forgiving too soon, laughing when afraid. And then, a few pages later, learning to eat, learning to stop apologizing for taking up space, learning to forgive and also to leave. The shock in Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power did not live in scandal. It lived in a grammar of recovery. A few entries lived in New York in rooms where she trained to be better than the photograph of her had allowed. They said, "Find the true action," she wrote about acting class. I found my true action in saying no and letting it be a complete sentence. She wrote about breath exercises and about a teacher who told her to look for attention in her own spine. It felt like betrayal of the world that trained me to be a firework, she wrote, to instead become a candle that did not perform, only burned. She wrote about walking across bridges alone and about the weather melting her makeup and feeling clean because of it. I refused a lunch with a man who called me kiddo and my hands shook for an hour, she wrote. But then I stopped shaking and ate something good and did not punish myself for eating. I had to keep reminding myself to write down condition notes. Pages 23 to 27 water-stained, legible. I scribbled awkwardly, then read them anyway. The water stains appeared where she wrote about grief, though she did not say grief directly. I could not hold the room together, she wrote after a day where everything seemed to have fallen out of its frame. I took off the dress that did not fit my ribs and sat on the floor and said out loud, "Help me." The room did not answer. My chest did. Something loosened in there like a tired knot. Her beliefs about faith did not sound like doctrine. They sounded like a woman lowering her shoulders because she had allowed herself to be carried when she had no more stamina to carry. Prayer felt like being held, she wrote. Power felt like being displayed. I chose the first and it cost me the second and I let it. The most startling page came near the back of the thickest section. The paper grew thinner there, almost onion skin, as if she had bought a different pad and glued these pages in. The headline the world later loved, "Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power," would have tried to live here. I suppose, in the sentences that refused to flatter any lever-puller. A nation that wanted me innocent and available did not want me thinking, she wrote. I learned to think in secret. I learned to let my face be the curtain and my mind be the play. She wrote that she feared the rooms where decisions made in secret were sold as fate. I watched very important men grind up the word promise and sprinkle it on their sentences like sugar, she wrote. I decided I would put my mouth on only what fed me. She wrote about a night when she turned down an invitation everyone called an opportunity. I went home and put on socks and made a sandwich and read a poem out loud, she wrote. It felt like treason in a country where success measured itself in photographs. I had never felt more free. I did not tell anyone at the law office what I had found. I asked for a day to verify annotations, which sounded official enough to earn me the time. I took the hatbox to a friend who worked in preservation at a university library. We set the journal under a soft lamp and read with gloves. My friend said the binding matched late 50s custom work, hand-sewn signatures. We peered at the monogram and the peculiar way the N had been struck deeper than the M. Someone did not want this mistaken, my friend said. We lifted the backboard and saw the faint seam of a hidden pocket. Inside, tucked like a witness in a pew, a single photograph, not of a face, but of two hands holding a book. The book was the same blue. The hands looked like hers because I had looked at photographs of her hands, The way the ring finger curled just slightly under, the way the thumb flattened against a spine when she read. There were people I needed to ask about provenance. A seamstress, if she still lived, who had built secret pockets in dresses. An old publicist who had once told me he forgot nothing and then forgot my name 3 times. A pastor from a church on La Brea where she might have gone in and out anonymously. I found not the pastor but his daughter, who remembered a blonde who came in late and left early and cried without making a sound. The daughter remembered a conversation in the alley where the woman said she did not believe in the God on the posters but believed in the God who did not need posters. She said she had been turned into a poster, the daughter told me. She said she missed her own eyes. I drove away with the diary seat belted as if I had placed a child in my passenger seat. I read at red lights, and I missed a green and the car behind me honked and I did not care. There was a page where she recounted an evening with a small circle of men who had access to rooms with maps on the walls. She sat on the floor and tucked her legs under and listened to them speak about outcomes as if they were recipes. When they asked for her thoughts, she did not perform. I said, "You build ladders to the moon and forget the step between the last 2 rungs." They laughed and called me poetic. I was not poetic. I was scared. She wrote that she measured the men not by what they promised but by how they treated the waiter when he spilled wine. The man who lifted his own napkin to help the boy had a better country in him, she wrote. The man who waited for someone else to fix it, did not. She did not pretend to saint herself either. I liked attention when it was soft, she wrote. I liked being approved of. I chased it like a child runs after the last bit of sun at the end of the block. Her honesty did not apologize for itself, it held itself tenderly and then asked for more from itself. I believed I could be both, serious and light, she wrote. I believed I could be believed. When she wrote about her own anger, the letters thickened as if the pen pressed harder. I was angrier than my face let me show, she wrote. I learned to put my anger in a drawer and then I forgot where the drawer was. I asked God for the drawer back. The law office began calling for the lot numbers. The hatbox had to become a number and then a line in a ledger and then an item in a room with paddle numbers and nods. I felt sick. I asked for 1 more day and then I lied and said the appraisal needed moisture assessment. The appraiser came and waved a meter over the blue leather and said, she kept it well, and of course that she did, because she kept everything that mattered where the photographers could not go. I read a passage that made me sit back, my hand over the hinge. I decided power was the ability to say enough and mean it, she wrote. I decided faith was the ability to say I am not alone and feel it. As the day fell into orange light, I ran a fingertip along the margin where she sometimes drew a little star next to a sentence she wanted to remember. Next to 1 star she had written what might have been her most dangerous prayer, make me immune to flattery and make me loud when needed. She wrote that she practiced saying, that's not true in hotel mirrors so that when the time came, it came out whole. She wrote that she had to relearn her own name. Marilyn was the costume, she wrote. Norma was the child. I wanted a 3rd name only God would know. I closed the book and did not breathe for a count of 10. That night I took the journal home. I should not have. I placed it on my kitchen table and made tea and read through midnight while the city settled into its dim hum. I turned to entries where she described her grandmother's Bible and the thin pages that made a sound like soft weather. I did not understand the verses, she wrote, but I loved the maps. She wrote about clinging to beatitudes because they seemed to honor the people the cameras forgot. Blessed are the poor in spirit, she wrote in her own hand like a copyist, and then below, blessed are the girls who smile until their cheeks ache and then close the door and go to sleep without the smile and wake up still loved. She wrote about power again, but now as something she negotiated with herself. I will not use my tenderness as a weapon, she wrote. I will not use my mischief to survive rooms I should exit. I will not let a paycheck write my soul. Near the end of the entries, though nothing felt like an end, there lay a small list, the kind of thing a person wrote in an airport or a car, leaning the page on a thigh. The list sat under the simple heading, When I Am Tempted. The items read like a catechism she built for herself. When I am tempted to be the girl in the picture, I will become the woman with a spine. When I am tempted to forgive too fast, I will count to 60 and breathe. When I am tempted to buy love, I will buy groceries. When I am tempted to show off, I will call a friend who tells me the truth. When I am tempted to forget God, I will put my hand on my chest and feel the good beating. The list ended with the same thin, brave humor that threaded the book. When I am tempted to believe the headlines, I will ask my dog who I am. In the last pocket of the cover I found a folded page that did not match the others. It looked like a letter she never sent. To anyone who calls me an angel, it began, angels do not get hungry. I did. Angels do not change their shoes twice in a day because the first one's cut. I did. Angels do not fumble with their keys like a tired person at 2 in the morning. I did. Do not make me an angel. Make me a woman you do not control. She wrote, if you ever hold this diary, be careful with the part of me that did not belong to the world. I closed the envelope and felt suddenly like I had intruded into a room where a person had been naked without shame. By morning, it felt wrong to let this blue book become an object with a price. I drove back to the preservation lab and asked my friend to lock it properly for a consultation. The law office asked me for the catalog copy they needed. I wrote an honest line that did not reveal what did not belong to me. Blue leather journal, circa 1958 to 1962, initials NM, personal reflections on acting, belief, and the pressures of public life. It did not say Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, though that sentence lived in my throat like a secret fire. I walked out onto the library lawn and sat in the shade and read the last entry again, the one dated a week before a party that would later be over-mythologized. I learned, she had written, that the truest prayer I ever prayed sounded like this, no, and the second truest sounded like this, thank you. The diary did not end with a flourish. It ended the way real life ended on ordinary days, with a note about a loaf of bread from a bakery she liked, with a reminder to call someone's mother, with a line about a book she promised to finish. The last sentence on the last page said, I will light a candle tonight and ask to feel ordinary. There was a tiny dot of wax at the bottom corner, as if the candle had answered. I closed the cover and felt like I had been taught a vow, to refuse to turn a person into product, to let a woman remain a woman. When I finally stood before the people who wanted to know why the hatbox had delayed, I told them the moisture content had required care and the glue had started to fail. That was true. I left out that something in me had rearranged. I left out that, as I crossed crosswalks and waited for elevators and answered emails, the pages murmured, and the title, Marilyn Monroe's Hidden Diary Reveals Her Shocking Beliefs About Faith and Power, followed me like a bell you heard long after you left the church. I made calls to people who might remember a seamstress and found her niece, who let me hold a thimble her aunt had worn until it had dented into the shape of her finger. The niece said her aunt had loved to hide small things in seams. She said women needed places no one could pat down, the niece told me. In that moment, I understood why the diary had not been labeled, why it had hidden under hats, why the monogram bore the name she had been born with, not the one the world insisted upon. I sat again with the book in the lab, the lights low, and prepared to copy key lines by hand because I did not trust a camera with this. I turned the back cover and felt the corner catch on something, the faintest resistance. A thin, nearly invisible second pocket had lived under the first, sealed with gum that had dry cracked. Inside, under a strip of onion skin tape, a final envelope waited with a short sentence written in pencil, for the day I am tired of being looked at. I slid it loose, heart pacing as if I had been running. I lifted the flap, and a single sheet slide whispered out onto the table. A single sheet slide whispered out onto the table and stopped against my thumb. The paper carried the faint smell of soap and powder, the kind of clean that belonged to a bathroom shelf, not a studio. In pencil, with the same steady, schoolgirl patience, she had titled it, When They Ask Me What I Believe. The lines were not for an audience, they were for a future self who would be too tired to explain. I believe, she had written, that power without kindness rots like fruit. I believe that the truest faith I found did not require a stage or a collection plate. It required a boundary. I believed men could bless or bruise a room by how they entered it, and so could I. I believed that a no said softly could be a prayer answered. Then below, in darker pencil, as if the thought needed carving, I believed I did not have to be holy to be held. There was more. Halfway down the sheet she had drawn a small square, a box like a window, and inside it a note to herself: practice, look out and not only in. Beneath that, 3 small memories stacked like photographs in a wallet. 1. The child who gave me her lollipop because she said I looked sad. 2. The old woman who told me my dress reminded her of a tulip and then asked if I had eaten. 3. The doorman who called me miss when everyone else called me by what they wanted. And then, these were sacraments. I do not know if I belonged in a church, but I knew I belonged among people who made the air gentler. I sat with that page under the lab lamp until the pencil felt warm on my skin. The sheet had been folded twice, evenly, and the creases suggested it had lived in the smaller pocket for years, taken out, read, returned like a worry stone. On the back she had written a paragraph that read like a private treaty. If anyone ever tries to trade me for favors, it said, I will trade my time for quiet instead. If anyone tries to dress my body and undress my dignity, I will go home and make soup and call a person who uses my name like a blessing. The handwriting loosened, the way a hand loosened after a long day. When I prayed, I did not ask to be famous. I asked to be forgiven for the days I thought fame would feed me. I replaced the paper in its envelope and slid the envelope back into the pocket. My friend in preservation, Lila, watched my face as I did it. Lila had spent her life protecting paper from air, light, hands, water, time. She knew when a page cut more cleanly than a knife. You're thinking about keeping it off the market, she said. It was not a question. I told her I did not want to watch a blue leather diary become a bullet point in a catalog with a headline written like a trap, even if the headline everyone would write, Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, carried the gravity of what I had heard in those pages. Lila nodded, the nod of a person who had helped more than one family decide what came out of a trunk and what went back under a bed. We boxed the diary in a neutral, acid-free coffin with soft cotton cradles that touched it as if it were skin. Lila typed a temporary accession note that sounded like a lullaby and a lie at once: consultation hold for provenance assessment, restricted handling. I signed my name in a small square and felt like I had adopted a bird with a broken wing. The law office called twice that afternoon. I stepped into the hallway and let their numbers light my screen and go out. When I called back I said the 4 words that bought time in my trade: conservation review in progress. The partner murmured about buyers and windows and press interest and then said, we trust your judgment, the way people said it when they meant, we trust our eventual proceeds. At home I could not stop reading my notes. The diary had braided belief and refusal, breath and boundary, into something I had not had a word for. Shock did not live in scandal. It lived in the discovery that she had built a small religion that fit in her palm. She did not make herself a prophet, she made herself a person. She wrote, I believed God and I had a quiet understanding, I would not perform for him, and he would not perform for me. She wrote, if power was a room with no doors, I would become a window. I lay awake knowing there were editors in offices who would grind those sentences into sugar and sprinkle them on the headline Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power until it stuck to every mouth in the country. The next day I drove to an address I had written in the margin of my notebook weeks earlier when this was not yet a story, only a task, a seamstress's niece in an apartment over a nail salon on Fairfax. She opened the door with pins stuck in her sweater and a magnifier on a chain. On her kitchen table lay a thimble dented so deeply it looked like it had grown bones. My aunt loved pockets, she said without prompting, as if the diary had already announced itself. She told me, a good pocket lets a woman carry her secrets without asking permission. She made secret pockets for a blonde actress who sent thank you notes on heavy paper. The niece could not remember the full name, only that it wasn't the one on the billboards. She said the actress signed with a name like a bell but monogrammed like a whisper. I showed her a photograph of the monogram, just the corner. She touched the N with her fingertip floating above the screen, not quite daring touch. That's her, she said, and then, almost to herself, that girl had so much to hide that wasn't shame. I asked about churches, and the niece told me her aunt had attended a storefront place near La Brea where the music came up from the floor. They kept the back row free, she said, for people who came in late and left early. She remembered the same blonde slipping in, head down, a scarf tied like a woman who did not want wind or eyes to catch her. She cried some Sundays, the niece said. Not loud. Just the kind of crying that washed a face clean. She remembered a pastor who did not sell anything, only blessed the tired. He said, God does not need your performance, only your presence. She wrote it down. The niece said this with certainty because she remembered the way the blonde pulled a small blue book out of a pocket and wrote as if she were saving rainwater. When I left, I had a name for a tailor who had worked on studio costumes and a rumor about a hospital visit made at night without cameras to sit with a woman who had lost a child. I drove to the tailor's shop, now a barber's place, and found the tailor's son sweeping hair. He told me his father had died with stories in his throat. He said she paid him extra to sew a narrow sleeve inside a dress, he said. He said she called it a place to put my hand when I need to hold my own hand. I thought of the diary in that hidden place, of a woman in a room full of cameras sliding her fingers over a soft spine in a private blessing. Back at the lab, I asked Lila to help me examine the binding boards again. The glue line along the rear hinge had an odd wrinkle. Lila warmed a micro spatula over a pad and lifted a thread no thicker than a hair. Another seam gave, smaller than the first two pockets. It was barely a slit, a breath in the board. I slid a feather under and drew out a strip of paper no wider than a ribbon, brittle and pale. On it, typed in a font that belonged to a home typewriter, a single sentence, "No one owns a woman's thinking." It had been trimmed close, as if someone had cut it from a longer page. On the back, in pencil, a note to herself, "Say this out loud when you are scared." I imagined her in a hotel mirror, the kind of mirror that saw 1,000 faces and never remembered a single one, speaking that sentence until it belonged to the muscles of her mouth. I knew then what the diary wanted me to do, which sounded absurd because paper did not want, but the feeling remained, protect the sentences from being turned into souvenirs. I requested a temporary injunction through the firm's court liaison, citing privacy and estate constraints and the need to verify chain of custody. The law partner sighed but signed the filing. My phone lit with a number I recognized from a national magazine that specialized in sanctifying and devouring, often in the same issue. The editor offered a serialization deal and an ethical frame. He used the word sensitive 3 times and the word exclusive 5. He promised to preserve the spirit of the pages, and then he said the phrase I had been dreading like a draft of cold air under a door. Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power. This is the kind of headline that writes itself. I told him nothing was writing itself here. I told him something had been written by hand. The days turned into a loop of reading and making phone calls and saying phrases about humidity and tape adhesive that had more moral heat in them than they had any right to. I read the sections where she described the actor's studio and the instructions that guided her out of performance and into something tender. The coach said, "Find the honest action," she had written. I found that sometimes the honest action was leaving. I believed leaving could be a prayer, too. She wrote about visiting a synagogue once with a friend and feeling something settle when the people swayed and said words older than any magazine. I did not know the language, but I knew the rock of it, she wrote. She wrote about walking into a Catholic church and lighting a candle and loving that no one asked her name to let her pray. I did not belong and I belonged, she wrote. Faith did not check my credentials. Her beliefs about power kept returning to small, measurable acts: who fetched a chair, who made space, who learned to listen to the person with no title. I stopped trusting the loudest voice first, she wrote, and started trusting the one who noticed when my hands shook. She recorded the moment a young assistant with ink on his fingers adjusted the thermostat in a room because she had folded her arms against the cold. He did not announce the kindness, she wrote. He planted it and left it to grow. She described that as power too, the power to ease, not control. If I ever ran anything important, she wrote, I would give the quiet people the best chairs. One afternoon, I received a message from a former studio publicist who had survived long enough to regret it. He asked to meet at a diner with cracked red booths and pie under glass. He pinched sugar into coffee as if he were salting a sidewalk. She read, he said without greeting. They liked to pretend she didn't, because reading didn't photograph well. He told me she carried poetry in her bag and sometimes left lines in makeup rooms the way people left tips. She taught me a word once, he said, counting the sugar grains on his napkin. Autonomy. I had to look it up after. She said, I am trying to build that inside. He shook his head, either in disbelief at himself or devotion to a memory. You want to know what shocked me, he said. Not who she knew. What she refused. She refused to give up the small part she called my own breath. That could freeze a room when people were used to yes. I walked out into a common Los Angeles afternoon, the sun a soft coin, the pavement giving heat back like a memory, and felt an ache I could not name. The diary had changed the way I understood the word confession. It did not confess sins as much as needs. I need quiet, she wrote. I need food. I need to not be surrounded only by men with plans. I need a God who does not trade favor for display. Shock pulsed in the ordinariness of it. In a country that turned her into a symbol, the most radical sentence she wrote might have been, I need to go home now. The law office pressed, politely at first and then with the kind of courtesy that sounded like hardware. A museum called to ask if I would consider an exhibition of star women's private writings. They promised a carefully lit room, glass that blocked 99% of ultraviolet, climate control, a catalog with a cover printed tastefully in serif type reading Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, the title wrapped like a ribbon around something they would keep safe on a pedestal. I imagined people hovering, phones raised, reading 2 sentences and moving on. I imagined the way noise ate meaning. I asked them if they had a bench. They said yes. I told them a bench mattered more to this book than a label. They did not understand, but they said they would find a better bench. At night I returned to that last folded page again, the one that read like a field guide for days when a life buckled. When I am tempted to make myself small, she had written, I will make soup and feed the first person who asks. When I am tempted to call the wrong person, she had written, I will call the right one and tell the truth. When I am tempted to forget that I am a person and not a poster, I will pet the dog until I remember. The dog appeared in 3 different entries, unnamed, a steady presence. In the margins she drew a small paw once, as if making herself laugh in a hotel where the jokes ran out early. I asked Lila to perform a page-by-page condition survey under magnification. We pulled up fibers under the camera and watched where the pencil had bitten harder and where the ink bled when tears had fallen. In the gutter near the center we found a thread caught on the fold, a hair blonde not by bottle but by sun. We did not test it. We did not need to. It sat there like proof that what I had been reading had warmed in a human lap. Lila wrote, spine solid, lower joint fragile. Surface grime minimal. Handling history consistent with careful personal use. It felt like a biography. Then came the call I had known would come. An intermediary for a collector whose name moved through auctions like weather offered a number that made the air in my kitchen feel light. He spoke of safes and vapor barriers and endowments and a private reading room. He spoke the way men in the diary had spoken when they called a cost an opportunity. I let him finish and then I told him about the girl with the lollipop and the doorman who said miss and the assistant who adjusted the thermostat. He said, I'm not sure I follow, and then he raised the offer and then he said what they always said. This is inevitable. I understood why people later told this story with a flair, why they sold it with the headline Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power as if the diary itself had ripped a veil off a room and shown us men in the dark. But that was not what I read. I read a woman who taught herself to breathe in a world that kept asking her to hold it. I read a woman who had learned to measure power by its effect on the temperature of a room. I read a woman who had decided that a god who needed her mascara was not a god who deserved her. In the last inches of the last pages, I found a note addressed to the version of herself who would want to surrender again. If you forget, she wrote, read this, you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to eat. You are allowed to ask to be loved softly. I did not sleep much in those days. I left the lab and drove the long way home on streets with small houses and jasmine over chain link. I thought about release and control and how often they masqueraded as each other in boardrooms. I thought about the first line in the first entry, if a light loves you, it asks nothing. I thought about my own job, the way I had learned to write descriptions like songs that hid their own teeth. I thought about the bench in the museum and the way, on that bench, someone could sit and read slowly, maybe with a hand on the glass, and feel less alone. I thought about the women who would come, late, leave early, and cry a little without a sound because the words had made air gentler for them. I thought about how the diary had already begun to change me, and how, if I failed it, I would become exactly what it warned me against, someone who sold the cure and the disease. So I wrote a letter to the estate attorney with the only argument that had any chance of holding. I said the diary carried legal risk if sold as a commodity, the privacy implications were not resolved, the provenance had kinks, the moral rights of the author mattered, the chain of custody needed a court's clarity. I wrote, too, that a curated, limited reading under academic protocols would honor both the legal and the human. I used words that did not read like prayer but felt like it. Lila countersigned with the weight of her work. The partner sent back a line I could have predicted, we will consider a loan for exhibit. On the morning we said we would begin redacting names in the few places they appeared, I opened to a page where she had drawn, in small, careful strokes, a ladder. Next to it, she wrote, do not climb what you do not believe in. Under that, be kind to yourself on the first rung. The simplicity shot through me sharper than any reveal. She had been building an ethic in pencil. She had been building a life inside a costume without letting the costume win. She had been making a bench of her own in every room with no place to rest. That afternoon, a pastor's daughter, now older than her mother had ever been, met me at the lab and asked to see the page her father might have inspired, or might not have, but liked to believe he had. Lila lowered the book under the lamp and turned to the entry about the back row and the women who came in late and wore the wrong shoes. The daughter read and pressed her finger on the glass near the word blessing. She whispered, not for us but for the person on the other side of 5 decades, we kept the back row for you. She put her hand flat on the table when she was finished, the way a person stabilized themselves after a long ride. We did not speak for a while. I collected my notes, my injunctions, my courage. I prepared to argue with people who would not understand how a diary could be public and also not for sale. I gathered the small human weight of witnesses, the seamstress's niece, the barber with the tailor's memory, the publicist with his belated dictionary, the pastor's daughter with her quiet row. In my bag, folded around the edges of legal paper and glued to my ribs with dread and conviction, a sentence from a pencil on a blue page kept beating like a quiet metronome, no one owns a woman's thinking. And somewhere inside the box, the candle wax dot on the last page hardened a little more with each passing day. As if recording time, as if telling me that a story like this did not end, it only deepened, like breath, like the kind of faith that did not sell itself to the highest bidder, like the kind of power that did not always sit on the dais but sometimes took the bench, sat in the back, and held the room together by refusing to perform. The hearing took place in a room too cold for truth. Fluorescence flattened everyone into the same shade of alert. The judge wore a face for whether he had seen too often, estates, artifacts, the arguments that danced in between. The law partner spoke in coins and contracts. I spoke in paper and breath. I said the words that mattered inside the words that counted: privacy, dignity, provenance, moral rights, injury. I did not read from Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, but I carried its sentences in my tone. Lila described the binding with the care of someone testifying about a friend's body. The judge asked what public interest meant in a case like this. I said the public interest grew when a thing remained itself. I said a sale turned a human document into a trophy. The judge looked at me over his glasses and then at the partner, and then he granted a narrow window, a temporary hold, a structured conservation period, an encouragement to pursue an agreement that did not turn a blue book into a headline pinned to velvet. Outside, sunlight made the courthouse steps look like a stage. I did not descend like a victor. I descended like a person who had borrowed a little time from a clock that rarely lent. The partner caught up to me and said a sentence that sounded like it belonged to a different man than the one who had rehearsed numbers inside. My daughter read one paragraph you sent. She stopped buying makeup for a week. She said she felt like a person. He cleared his throat, embarrassed by his own confession. Find me a way to do the right thing without getting sued, he said, and then he walked away like a man who did not know yet how to be that kind of father in public. We built a plan that did not look like a plan to anyone who craved spectacle. Lila drafted protocols that read like ceremony. One reader at a time. Cotton gloves when necessary and bare clean hands when necessary, because graphite needed skin to speak. No phones. A bench with a back, placed at an angle that let a person see the page without seeing their reflection in the glass. A bowl of wrapped hard candy at the desk by the door, a small nod to a child's lollipop that had once saved a day for a stranger. A sign by the register where people signed their names if they wished, "Be gentle here." The sign did not advertise Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, though the room contained that gravity the way a church contained song even when no one sang. We invited no press at first. We invited women who worked night shifts and day shifts and no shifts, a retired teacher, a nurse whose hand shook when she told us she had not read a book since her husband died, an actress who had played a woman like a joke and wanted to apologize to someone, a man who taught sewing to veterans and came because the word pocket meant something spiritual to him. People read. They did not read quickly. When they finished, some touched the bench, as if thanking a piece of wood. Some cried the quiet way, the way the pastor's daughter had described. Some laughed at a line where she teased herself about eating too few sandwiches. A woman in a winter coat in summer said, she made a religion out of leaving at the right time, and then she stood and walked out like a person obeying a bell. Every night, after the last reader left and the lights dimmed, I copied sentences by hand into my notebook, not the celebrity lines that would later tug eyes, but the small vows. I will not apologize for using my full voice. I will forgive slowly. I will buy groceries instead of favors. I read the entry that began, "If a light loves you, it asks nothing," and I watched Lila tilt the lamp until the indentations around the words became mountains under slant light. The pencil had pressed hardest where she wrote the word nothing, as if insisting on emptiness as a form of mercy. It required no magic to see what she had erased on another page, under a candle smudge, the ghost of a sentence returned under oblique light. I did not accept miracles that asked me to disappear. She had erased it once, perhaps afraid of her own audacity, and yet the page had remembered. Paper remembered what the world tried to make a woman forget. Between reading hours, I followed threads that the diary left like crumbs. The orphanage where she stole raisins did not keep perfect records, but a woman in an archive pulled a box down from a shelf and produced a kitchen ledger with a note in the margin about a girl who asked for extra bread and then gave it to another girl. The seamstress's niece called to say she had found a dress pattern with pocket measurements scribbled in a hand that did not match her aunt's, a looping script that wrote numbers like letters with curves. The tailor's son phoned to say he had remembered something else. His father said she once sewed a tiny envelope into a hem and danced while he worked, to keep from crying. She said dancing made her lungs brave, he told me. I wrote it down, hearing a rhyme with her line about breath and autonomy. One morning a man in a suit arrived early and waited under the jacaranda tree until Lila unlocked the lab. He introduced himself as counsel for a foundation with a boardroom reputation and soft money. He spoke gently, like a person coaxing a cat out from under a bed. He promised an endowment, a quiet room, a catalog that did not need to shout, a reading program for girls who had been turned into posters and wanted their names back. He did not say the full headline, Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, but it hovered between us, a rope that could pull one way or the other. He said, we could do this right, and I believed he believed that. I also believed what the diary had taught me, that the right thing had less to do with money and more to do with whether a body could breathe in the room you built for it. The pastor's daughter came back with a shoebox of program leaflets from the storefront church. On the back of one leaflet a note in pencil had bled through, "God is not a producer," and a tiny star next to it. The daughter said a woman had handed her that leaflet in the alley one night, saying, "I liked this sentence." The daughter had kept it for decades without knowing why. We knew now. We put it under glass next to an empty space that explained why the diary remained closed while we tried to make its life safe. When the museum called again, they had a new voice on the line, a curator who sounded like she had sat on benches more than she had stood on stages. She said she did not want a blockbuster, she wanted a room that felt like breath. She said she wanted to build the back row first and let the front seats wait. I asked her what she would title the exhibition. She said, "I would not title it like a sales pitch. I would title it like a note to self." And then she said, very quietly, "But if the estate insisted on something like Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, I would place that phrase on the outside of the building to pay the rent and keep something truer on the inside." I laughed, for the first time in days, a laugh that felt like a pressure valve loosening. We were getting somewhere a person could sit. We built a pilot exhibit in a university room with windows we could darken and open, depending on the hour. We made a rule about silence that did not feel punitive. We printed a small brochure that held no pictures of her face, only sentences from the last pages that could teach a person to leave, eat, and be loved softly. We placed a photograph of two hands holding a blue book, the one from the hidden pocket, and we let the hands be the face. On opening day, people lined up quietly. A woman who looked like she shepherded children for a living brought 3 teenagers and sat them on the bench and did not speak. A man in a suit sat in the back and took off his tie after 5 minutes. A security guard cried, the way men who were not allowed to cry in uniforms sometimes cried, shoulders still, eyes overflowing. Someone left a tulip on the windowsill. Someone else left a note that read, "Blessed are the room builders." The law partner stood against the wall like a man checking exits. He watched a woman trace a line on the protective glass with her fingertip hovering a hair above, not touching it, reading a sentence that had already begun to move through the city like a quiet anthem, "No one owns a woman's thinking." He watched Lila show a child how onion skin paper sounded like weather. He looked down at his phone and then up at the book, and when his daughter arrived and sat without drama and read without hurry, he stood straighter and let his phone sleep. When she finished, she took the bowl of wrapped candy and walked it over to the bench and placed it there, as if to say, "Let the sweetness stay where the reading happens." Days became a practice. We opened the book as one lit a candle. We let the pages breathe. We closed it when a person needed to see it closed, to know it was cared for and not consumed. In the afternoons, after the last appointment, I drove to streets no one wrote about and watched women hurry with bags and keys, hair pulled back, faces unadorned, the kind of powerful the diary meant, the kind that fetched chairs and adjusted thermostats and said enough and meant it. I thought of the line that described a nation that wanted her thinking private and her face public, and I watched faces that carried their thinking like lanterns inside. I stopped at a market near a laundromat and bought bread from a woman who said, "Good choice," in a way that made the day bless me. The press arrived eventually, as press did, with lenses and schedules and a hunger that had fed and starved the same mouth for a century. We wrote a press release that read like a prayer disguised as a paragraph, "This room exists for reading, not taking." We allowed 3 photographs, the hands with the blue book, the bench with the empty space beside it, and the bowl of candy with its wrappers bright and stubborn. We did not release pages. We released the practice. One outlet refused our terms and wrote its own story, complete with the headline "Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power," and a body that rehearsed old myths. Another sent a reporter who asked permission to sit. He sat. He read. He turned in a piece that quoted no names and studied no rumors. He wrote about the way graphite caught in paper like pollen. He wrote about a woman's handwriting becoming a country. At night I found myself changing in ways no audience could applaud. I ate when I was hungry. I stopped apologizing for saying no to rooms that asked me to disappear to earn admission. I lit a candle on my kitchen table and did not ask it to become a spotlight. I called the right person and told the truth. The title Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power had started as a bell rung by other mouths. It had become a bell I heard in my ribs when I crossed streets and chose doors. It had become, in the most ordinary way, a prayer I did not need to whisper because my life kept answering it. One late afternoon, as the jacaranda decided to let its purple go and the lab took on that golden hour her city knew so well, a woman in a navy skirt and sensible shoes arrived without an appointment and asked if she could just see the cover. She did not need to read, she said, she needed to know the blue existed. Lila glanced at me and I nodded the way a person nodded before breaking a small rule on purpose. We lifted the lid and let the woman look. She put her hand over her mouth the way people covered laughter or lightning. I teach ninth grade, she said softly. I taught my girls this year that power could be as simple as staying seated when the room tried to make them stand. She smiled at the diary like a co-conspirator. Do you know, she said, you built us a back row. She left a note in the registry that read, "Blessed are the benches." We never stopped finding the human seams. A letter arrived, written in slanted script on thin paper, from a woman whose mother had cleaned apartments on Franklin and remembered a girl with a scarf who left her the better pair of shoes with a folded page inside. A page copied by hand. When I am tempted to believe the headlines, I will ask my dog who I am. The woman said her mother had kept the shoes and the page through 3 moves and a divorce and 2 births. She sent a photograph of the page. The slant of the letters matched the diary's slant like 2 sisters recognizing each other across a room. I went back to the hatbox because the hatbox had wrapped this whole thing like a joke that turned out to be a door. Its lining had a stitch that puckered slightly, not like wear but like repair. A conservator's eye was a suspicious eye. I asked Lila to help me unpick the repair in the safest way. Inside, not a ribbon, not a jewel, not a scandal, 2 receipts and a note. One receipt came from a corner bakery, bread, butter, a slice of cake. The other came from a hardware store, matches, twine, a small box of hooks. The note said, "Keep your sweetness. Hang your boundaries." I sat back and laughed, the kind that did not cut anyone. The hatbox had not concealed an artifact of gossip. It had hidden a grocery list and instructions for a life. It had hidden the tools for hanging a line and the food to keep yourself kind while doing it. By then, the estate had begun to understand that money could arrive without selling out what made this worth money. The partner drafted a long-term loan to the university and the museum in rotation. The foundation funded the bench and, in a rare moment of institutional grace, did not insist on naming it after a donor. We called it the bench. People came and sat and read and left, not with souvenirs, but with sentences they could use like hooks when the wind rose. They repeated the title, Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, in their kitchens and cars and texts to friends, and sometimes they did it wrong on purpose, the way the pastor's daughter had smiled and said, "Shocking? Not to me. Familiar." The shock belonged to systems. The recognition belonged to people. I kept following the small historical threads, because history, I had learned, did not consist only of graves and grand openings. It held receipts, bench screws, thimbles dented into the shape of a life. A former photo assistant brought us a contact sheet with a few frames of hands and book spines. He said she had asked him to frame a shot without her face. She said faces get me in trouble, he remembered, hands get me free. A studio guard mailed me a pass from a long-closed gate with N. Mortensen scribbled on it because the lady asked me not to write the other name for once. On the back of the pass, in ballpoint hearts, a message survived for a stranger, "Be kind to yourself on the first rung." The diary continued to teach its ethic in pencil. People stopped me on sidewalks to show me pages in their phones where they had written their own lists titled, "When I am tempted." A woman at a bus stop held up a napkin where she had written, "When I am tempted to be charming instead of honest, I will be late and honest." A man in a work vest said, "I adjusted the thermostat in a meeting today." No one noticed. I did it for her. He did not have to say the name. He was part of the chorus of quiet that had found itself. The room, the bench, the diary, the people, they formed a practice that resisted being wrapped up like a bow around an artifact. We had not ended anything. We had begun something circular and ordinary and radical, a reading that changed breath. The title remained our bell. Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, sounded by other mouths in other rooms, sometimes too loudly, sometimes just right, but always pointing back to a blue book that held a woman's thinking the way a pocket held a hand, hidden in plain sight, strong enough to steady a person through a day they had been expected to perform their way through. The practice deepened until it felt like a promise kept. Weeks after the pilot room opened, the estate lawyer returned with a revised document and a quieter face. He had underlined phrases that sounded almost like the diary's own voice: long-term loan renewed in perpetuity, exhibition conditions tied to care not spectacle, reproduction limited to excerpts chosen for breath not buzz. He had added a clause that made my throat tighten: the bench must always be present, and there must always be an unobstructed back row. He said he had argued for it in a conference room that had never considered a bench holy. He slipped his pen into his pocket and looked toward the glass. "Call it whatever you need to call it," he said. "Even Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, if that pays the utilities. But keep the room itself from shouting." For once, the headline felt like a door we decided how wide to open. On the first day of the formal exhibit, the museum turned the lights down to a human level and let the air settle around the blue book like water around a stone. Nobody clapped. People just sat. A docent with a voice made for lullabies explained that graphite preferred clean, dry skin, and that sometimes bare hands were more respectful than gloves, that care wore many shapes. A girl in a denim jacket mouthed lines to herself as she read, one of them the sentence that had traveled like a lantern across the city: "No one owns a woman's thinking." A man in a construction vest took off his hat before approaching the case, not because anyone told him to, but because reverence had a way of teaching itself without signs. A gentle controversy rolled through the press like weather moving over a valley. One magazine put Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power on its cover in type so large it cast a shadow. Inside, a thoughtful columnist wrote about a bench. A late-night host made a joke about secrets in hatboxes and then, in an awkward turn, admitted he had cried in the reading room. An opinion piece declared we had sanctified a starlet, and a letter to the editor from a seamstress in Pomona replied, "We built a safe pocket." The museum's visitor ledger thickened with names and notes, little vows copied in strangers' hands. "When I am tempted to be agreeable instead of true," someone wrote, "I will go home. When I am tempted to forgive so fast I disappear," wrote another, "I will forgive slowly and stay." The ledger became an echo of the blue book: public, unpriced, stubbornly ordinary. Lila and I kept working the way people worked in rooms where the object on the table made everyone careful with their verbs. We inspected hinges, swapped out mounts, adjusted the angle of the lamp so that readers did not see themselves in the glass. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of dust and citrus cleaner, a white-haired man arrived with a paper sack and a shy posture. He introduced himself as a retired projectionist. He had run reels in rooms where her face had filled the dark like an eclipse. "I watched crowds watch her," he said, folding and unfolding the top of the bag. "I never watched her alone." He asked if he could sit on the bench without reading. He sat and breathed and then left a sandwich on the staff table with a note, "For whoever forgot to eat." I ate half and Lila ate half, and we laughed, and something in the room felt seen. The fragments kept stitching themselves into a garment that fit. The orphanage ledger's margin note acquired context when a nurse from a long-closed clinic wrote to say her mother remembered a night call from a famous young woman who asked if she could sit with a patient who had no one. The clinic had declined. Liability. The nurse's mother had gone to the alley and found the young woman waiting there anyway, sitting on the curb with a paper bag. "She handed me a loaf of bread," the mother had said, "and asked me to take it to the patient's sister." We added nothing of this to a label. We told the story in the staff room and then we ate the bread we would have otherwise skipped. For months the blue book existed not as a reveal but as a rhythm. People came, read, and left changed in ways only they would ever measure. A teenager with glitter on their eyelids whispered, "I thought I needed to be loud to be real," and then, after a while, I can be quiet and be real. A grandmother with a cane pressed the soft spot on the bench where countless hands had rested and said, I remember the first time she smiled at me from a screen. I didn't know she could write like I wrote in my head. A security guard adjusted the thermostat before anyone asked. I'm learning, he said to no one in particular. The headline, Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, floated outside the room on posters and digital marquees, paying the rent. Inside, the sentences did their work like yeast, they raised people. Not everything went gentle. An investor sent a lawyer with a stack of papers thick as regret, insisting on access and reproduction in exchange for a donation that could have gilded the entire wing. He said the quiet part loudly, headlines moved donors. The board met in a room that smelled like polished wood and shared guilt. I brought a copy of the clause about benches and back rows and read it out loud, not because it had legal teeth, but because it had a spine. Lila described graphite again, the way it sank into fibers like a thought sinking into a person. The board voted to say no, and for a week people hedged the word with explanations. Then the word stood by itself, a complete sentence, the truest prayer in the diary. On an evening that leaned toward rain, the pastor's daughter returned with a brittle photograph of the storefront church taken long after it had closed, windows boarded, hand-painted sign faded to a ghost. On the back she had written, back row still here. We put the photograph inside the hat box, under the receipts for bread and hooks. It felt right that the box carried a grocery store's sweetness and a hardware store's firmness. Keep your sweetness. Hang your boundaries. We repeated it when we negotiated shipping, we repeated it when someone asked for a selfie in front of the case, and we gently asked them to put the phone away. The last thing we found arrived the way the first had, quiet, wrapped as if it were only a hat. A small parcel came from a storage unit auction in Reseda, the kind of place where lives went to be sorted by strangers. Inside lay a dress pattern traced in pencil for a slim sheath with a note in the seam allowance, inner sleeve for hand. Taped near the hem, a thin scrap of onion skin carried a sentence typed with a machine that misstruck its O's. Blessed are the women who find the hidden pocket. Underneath, in pencil on the back, a line that made me sit down hard, leave something for the next girl. We placed the pattern in a flat file and we placed the sentence in the work we did every day. We left something, a seat, a candy, a kindness, a rule that remembered breath. When the museum's first run ended, the blue book returned to the university lab the way a person went home after a long day, tired, intact, with a scent of other people's hands. We closed the cover, loosened the cotton cradles, and let the spine rest. Lila logged the condition in language that had become a liturgy, text block sound, reader impact high, meaning retained. We wrote to the estate and the foundation and the museum, and we wrote to the woman in the denim jacket and the man in the vest and the teacher with ninth graders to tell them the room would open again in the fall. No RSVP required. Back row open. On the night before the book moved to climate control for a month of rest, I stayed late. The lab lights hummed the way city lights hummed at a distance. I set the diary on the table and turned to the last page we allowed ourselves to turn. The dot of wax looked whiter under the lamp, as if it had taken on the room's patience. I read the sentences I had memorized without meaning to, the ones where she made a catechism for herself, where she chose soup over flattery and benches over platforms, where she refused to let a paycheck write her soul. I thought again about the title that had chased this whole life into a room, Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power, and I understood, in my bones, that the shock never belonged to her. The shock belonged to anyone who believed power could only be loud and faith could only be performed. I pulled my notebook toward me and, for the first time since the hatbox opened, wrote something I had been avoiding because it felt like borrowing. At the top of a clean page I wrote, when I am tempted, and I let my own hand tell the truth in small, stubborn sentences. When I am tempted to market a person, I wrote, I will build a bench. When I am tempted to use a headline to hide a heart, I wrote, I will turn down the volume and read again. When I am tempted to believe access is love, I wrote, I will buy bread. Then, because I could not help it, I copied her last line below mine as a closing that did not sell anything, a closing that simply held, I will light a candle tonight and ask to feel ordinary. I did not bring a candle into the lab. I went home, and in my kitchen, I lit one. The room did not applaud. It warmed. In the months that followed, the blue book lived what felt like a second life, visible without being consumed, surrounded by a practice that guarded its ordinariness the way a hand guarded a tender wrist. The museum's exterior banners still used the title Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power to beckon people in, but inside the bench kept its quiet stubborn place, the thermostat learned a human language, and the back row stayed open. The estate formalized the loan into a gift that did not feel like a surrender, it felt like fidelity. The document included an appendix written by the partner's daughter, now a law student, who had sat on the bench one unremarkable morning and decided to keep her face when the profession asked for a mask. She wrote, "Condition of gift, the book's care must continue to protect what made it necessary, room to breathe, refusal to perform, allowance for small vows." We sealed the hatbox with new linen tape and a catalog number that did not shout. We wrote a final label that explained nothing sensational and everything essential: Blue Leather Journal, circa 1958 to 1962. Initials NM. Contents: reflections on acting, conscience, hunger, boundaries, and breath. Handling: slow. In the registry, I added a line that belonged only to our private records, the kind of note invisible to the public but binding to a conscience: leave something for the next girl. On the morning the second run opened, the pastor's daughter arrived early and sat in the back row before any visitors filed in. She did not read. She closed her eyes and held the room together the way some women always had, with presence instead of demand. A man in a suit adjusted the thermostat. A docent set a bowl of wrapped candies just so. Lila angled the lamp until the page glowed and not the glass. The doors opened, and people came, and people read, and people left. The title Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power continued to do its noisy work out there in the world. In here, the shock softened into recognition, and the recognition hardened into practice, and the practice became a way of treating not only a book but a life. I walked out at lunch and bought a loaf of bread and a small coil of twine from the hardware store next door, because old instructions held. I took both back to the lab. I tore the bread in half and placed it in the staff room with a note, "Eat," and I cut the twine into lengths and tied tags on a stack of pencils for visitors who wanted to write their own "When I am tempted" on a card and take it home in a pocket. The simplest acts felt like the truest inheritance. No one owned this thinking. That was the belief, and also the power. That evening, when the city dimmed itself to glow, I stood in the doorway and watched a young woman in a thrift store blazer sit, red, and straighten her shoulders an almost invisible amount. She pressed her palm to the bench, smiled like a person who had recognized a word in a foreign alphabet, and left without fanfare. I turned off the lamp and closed the book, the hinge sighing its small, contented breath. Marilyn Monroe's hidden diary reveals her shocking beliefs about faith and power had drawn an audience with a promise of revelation. It had given them something sturdier than shock. It had given them a way to live an ordinary day without surrendering themselves. I locked the door and walked into the night with the easy relief of someone who had finished a hard thing without breaking it. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. On my kitchen table, the candle burned low. I let it go out on its own. In the warm dark, the simplest of her sentences laid itself across the day like a blanket: "No thank you." In a city that had taught me to measure everything by applause, I counted by breath. And in that counting, I understood the last, quiet truth the blue book kept patiently teaching: that faith asked for presence, not performance, and that power, when it was clean, felt like a bench held steady for the next person who needed to sit and gather herself before she went back out to choose her doors.